The salt-tinged breeze carried memories through the open window of the small coastal library where Amira worked, her fingers tracing the spines of weathered books. 3 years had passed since that terrible phone call, yet sometimes she still caught herself, listening for the familiar sound of combat boots on the wooden steps outside. Tariq had been everything the town expected from a Navy SEAL strike. Disciplined, quietly confident. But what they hadn't seen were the gentle moments, how he'd read poetry aloud in Arabic while she organized books, or the way he'd scratched behind Rex's ears while planning their future together. The young German shepherd had been barely 8 weeks old when they'd brought him home. A squirming ball of black and tan fur that would grow into something extraordinary. He needs structure, Tariq had explained, holding the puppy while Amira prepared dinner. But more than that, he needs purpose. We'll train him together. Those months had been golden. Every morning before dawn, they'd take Rex to the beach where Tariq would run him through exercises that seemed part play, part military precision. Amira learned the commands in both English and Arabic, watched as Tariq taught the dog to read body language, to distinguish between normal activity and genuine threats. Rex wasn't just learning obedience, he was learning protection. Why so intense? She'd asked one evening as Tariq worked with Rex on complex hand signals. Tariq looked up from where he knelt beside the dog, his dark eyes serious. Because I won't always be here to protect you, but he will be. The words had seemed dramatic then, spoken under a canopy of stars while waves crashed rhythmically against the shore. Now they felt prophetic, Amira closed the book she'd been pretending to read and walked to the window overlooking the town square. Parents pushed strollers along sidewalks while teenagers gathered outside the ice cream shop, their laughter carrying on the evening air. Normal life in a normal town, where the most dangerous thing was usually a tourist driving too fast down Main Street. Rex appeared at her side, as he always did when her thoughts grew heavy. At 3 years old, he was magnificent 90 pounds of muscle and intelligence. His coat thick and glossy, his amber eyes alert and knowing. To anyone watching, he looked like a well-trained pet. Only Amira knew the truth. She rested her hand on his head, feeling the familiar comfort of his presence. Ready for our walk, Habibi? His tail wagged once, controlled and quiet. Even his enthusiasm had military precision as they prepared to leave the library. Amira caught her reflection in the glass door. 28 years old, with long black hair, usually pulled back in a simple bun, and dark eyes that had learned to hide their sadness. The townspeople saw a quiet librarian who lived alone, who walked the same route every evening without protection or company. They had no idea that love had trained her guardian well. The training, the months following Tariq's funeral, had been the darkest of Amira's life. Well-meaning neighbors brought casseroles and offered condolences, but their pitying glances only deepened her isolation. Everyone expected her to break, to crumble under the weight of losing her fiancé so young. Instead, she found strength in honoring his final gift. Every morning at 5, when the town still slept, Amira and Rex would drive to the secluded beach where Tariq had first taught them both. She carried a worn notebook filled with his handwriting detailed instructions for advanced protection training that went far beyond basic obedience. Protection isn't about aggression. She read aloud one morning, Rex sitting attentively beside her on the sand. It's about precision, about knowing when to watch, when to warn, and when to act. Rex's ears twitched at the familiar cadence of the Arabic commands Tariq had taught them. Amira continued his education methodically, teaching him to distinguish between normal strangers and potential threats, to move silently through shadows, to respond to subtle hand signals that looked like casual gestures to untrained eyes. The most important lesson was restraint. Rex learned to track potential dangers from a distance, to position himself strategically, to wait for Amira's signal before acting. During her evening walks through town, he would follow 50 yards behind. Invisible to casual observers, but always watching, Mrs. Brennan from the flower shop often stopped Amira during these walks, shaking her gray head with concern. "Dear, it's not safe for a young woman to walk alone after dark. This isn't the big city, but still." Amira would smile politely, appreciating the kindness while knowing the truth. She was never alone. Rex moved through the landscaped yards and narrow alleys like a ghost, his dark coat blending with evening shadows. He knew every potential hiding spot, every possible escape route, every sight line along her route. The training expanded beyond basic protection. Rex learned to detect stress hormones, to read micro-expressions, to sense when someone's intentions shifted from casual interest to something darker. He could distinguish between a jogger's heavy breathing and the elevated heart rate of someone planning violence. One evening, as Amira practiced the subtle hand signal that meant assess threat, she noticed old Mr. Hassan watching from his porch across the street. The elderly man had served in the Jordanian army decades ago, and something in his observant gaze suggested he recognized military precision when he saw it. "Your walking companion is well trained," he said the next day when she stopped by his small grocery store. Amira's pulse quickened, but Mr. Hassan's knowing smile was warm, not threatening. "My Tariq believed in being prepared," she replied carefully. "Smart man. Some lessons are worth continuing." As weeks turned to months, Rex's skills sharpened to an extraordinary degree. He could identify the difference between someone window shopping and someone casing a location. He knew which footsteps belonged to familiar neighbors and which suggested unfamiliar presence. Most importantly, he learned to trust Amira's judgment completely, to act only on her command, but to act decisively when that command came. The townspeople remained oblivious. They saw a grieving woman walking alone, vulnerable and unprotected. They didn't notice the shadow that followed her route, or the amber eyes that watched from hidden vantage points, or the intelligence that cataloged every face, every sound, every potential danger. Amira had become something the town didn't expect: a woman protected by love itself, trained by loss, and prepared for whatever darkness might find her. The routine 6 months into their new rhythm. Amira's evening walks had become as predictable as the lighthouse beacon that swept across the harbor every 30 seconds. She left the library precisely at 7, locked the front door with deliberate care, and began her route through the winding streets that connected the historic district to the residential neighborhoods above. The townspeople had grown accustomed to seeing her solitary figure moving through their quiet streets. Mrs. Chen would wave from her kitchen window while washing dinner dishes. The teenagers outside Murphy's diner would nod politely as she passed, their conversations briefly muted out of respect for the young widow. What none of them noticed was the systematic way Amira varied her pace and timing within that predictable framework. Sometimes she would pause to admire Mrs. Rodriguez's garden, giving Rex time to scout ahead. Other evenings, she might stop to pet a neighbor's cat, allowing her guardian to circle back and check for followers. 2 casual observers. These seemed like spontaneous moments of a woman enjoying a peaceful walk. Rex had perfected the art of invisible protection. He moved through the town's network of back gardens and side alleys like smoke, always maintaining visual contact with Amira while remaining completely hidden from view. His route was more complex than hers, a carefully planned circuit that allowed him to approach her path from multiple angles, checking for anything unusual. It was during the 3rd week of October that Khalil began watching her. He was new to town, a 20-something man who'd moved in with distant relatives after what the local gossips whispered was trouble with the law in the city. Khalil had the restless energy of someone unaccustomed to small-town peace, and his presence made longtime residents slightly uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite articulate. Amira first noticed him outside the hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon, his dark eyes following her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. When she glanced back from half a block away, he was still watching, making no effort to hide his interest. That evening, Rex's behavior changed subtly. His usual relaxed surveillance became heightened, his movements more deliberate. During her walk, Amira caught glimpses of him repositioning more frequently than normal, staying closer to her route. When she reached the small park that marked the halfway point of her circuit, she gave the hand signal that meant report. Rex appeared briefly at the edge of the tree line, his stance alert but controlled. His focused gaze toward the street behind her told her everything she needed to know. Someone was following at a distance, trying to establish her patterns. Over the following weeks, Khalil's presence became a constant shadow. he would appear at various points along her route, sometimes openly watching from street corners, other times attempting stealth that was laughably obvious to someone trained to notice surveillance. He began bringing friends to other young men whose body language suggested they were planning something more than casual observation. The town remained oblivious. Neighbors continued their friendly waves, secure in their assumption that their quiet streets held no real dangers. Even when Mrs. Brennan mentioned seeing some new fellow asking questions about the librarian, it was said with mild curiosity rather than concern. Amira continued her walks with outward calm, but she began carrying her phone charged and ready. She reviewed Rex's emergency commands, practiced the subtle signals that would call him to her side instantly. Most importantly, she prepared herself mentally for the inevitable moment when watching would escalate to action. Love had taught her patience. Loss had taught her strength, and Tariq's training had taught her to be ready. The test the attack came on a foggy Thursday evening in November, when the marine layer rolled in thick enough to muffle sound and obscure sightlines. Amira had just passed the old church when she became aware of footsteps synchronizing with hers, the casual rhythm of someone heading in the same direction. But the deliberate matching of someone trying to remain undetected. She maintained her normal pace while using a storefront window's reflection to confirm what Rex's earlier positioning had already told her. 3 figures were following approximately 30 yards behind, their spacing too tactical to be coincidental. Khalil walked in the center, flanked by his 2 companions. They had waited for the perfect evening, poor visibility, few pedestrians. A stretch of her route that passed through the older part of town where buildings stood farther apart. Amira felt her heartbeat steady rather than accelerate. Months of mental preparation had trained her body to channel adrenaline into clarity rather than panic. She continued walking, her hand dropping casually to her side in what looked like a natural gesture, but was actually the signal for close surveillance. Somewhere in the fog behind her, Rex acknowledged the command with a movement so subtle only she would notice, a brief shadow crossing between 2 streetlights. The men closed distance gradually, their confidence growing with each block. Amira could hear fragments of their whispered conversation, crude speculation about her loneliness, her vulnerability, what they planned to take from her besides money. Their words confirmed what their body language had already revealed. This wasn't random crime, but predation, carefully planned and deliberately executed. When they reached the narrow alley between the old bakery and the antique shop, Khalil called out to her, "Hey, library lady, you shouldn't walk alone at night. Dangerous things happen to women who don't have protection." Amira turned to face them, her expression calm and steady. In the yellow glow of the single streetlight, she could see their faces clearly. Halal's predatory smile, the nervous excitement of his companions who were working themselves up for violence. "I appreciate your concern," she replied, in a voice that carried no fear, only quiet strength. "But I'm not alone." Khalil laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the brick walls. "I don't see anybody else here, sweetheart. Just you and us." "That's unfortunate for you," Amira said softly. Her right hand moved in a gesture that looked like she was adjusting her, Jaquita's slight motion that lasted less than a second. To the 3 men, it appeared meaningless. They had no way of knowing it was the signal Tariq. Designed for maximum threat response, Rex exploded from the shadows with the precise violence of his military training. 90 pounds of muscle and focused aggression struck Khalil's center mass, driving him to the ground before the man could react. The impact was calculated in a force to immobilize without causing permanent damage. Exactly as Tariqa had taught, the other 2 men froze in shock as Rex positioned himself between them and Amira. His growl, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the alley's brick walls. His amber eyes reflected the streetlight as he assessed both targets, ready to engage either one who moved aggressively toward his charge. "What the hell?" one of them stammered. "Backing against the wall?" military-trained Amira said calmly, as if discussing the weather. "Navy SEAL program. He's been taught to neutralize threats with minimal force, but that calculation changes if you make any sudden movements." Khalil groaned from the ground where Rex held him pinned with precise pressure points. The dog's teeth were visible but not deployed, a clear warning that compliance would be rewarded with restraint. "You have 30 seconds to leave," Amira continued. "I suggest you use them wisely. The two standing men needed only 10. They fled into the fog, their footsteps echoing frantically off the empty streets. Khalil scrambled away moments later, his bravado completely evaporated, leaving behind only the metallic taste of fear and the sudden understanding that he had severely miscalculated his target. As silence returned to the alley, Rex moved to Amira's side, his posture relaxed but alert. She knelt beside him, her hands finding the familiar comfort of his thick coat, while her heart finally acknowledged what had just occurred. The realization the police report was filed the next morning, though Amira doubted it would lead to much action. Officer Martinez had listened to her account with professional courtesy, but she could see the skepticism in his eyes when she described Rex's intervention. Small-town cops weren't accustomed to dealing with military-trained protection dogs, and the absence of serious injuries made the incident seem less dramatic than it had felt in the moment. "We'll keep an eye out for these fellows," Martinez assured her. Though they both knew Khalil and his friends were probably already halfway to another town, you might want to consider varying your walking schedule. Maybe stick to more populated areas. Amira nodded politely, knowing she would do no such thing. Fear had never been allowed to dictate her choices, and it wouldn't start now. That evening, she sat on her back porch overlooking the ocean, Rex lying beside her chair with his head resting on her feet. The fog had cleared, revealing stars that sparkled above the dark water like scattered diamonds. It was the kind of night she and Tariq used to spend planning their future, a small house by the sea. Children who would grow up strong and brave, a life built on love and mutual respect. "I used to think love was something that ended," she said aloud, her fingers stroking Rex's ears. "When someone dies, when circumstances change, when life forces you apart. But that's not true, is it?" Rex's tail moved once against the wooden deck, a gentle thump of agreement. "Love doesn't disappear. It just changes form. It becomes wisdom, becomes strength, becomes protection." She looked down at her guardian, whose amber eyes reflected the starlight. "You're not just Tariq's dog. You're his love, still taking care of me." The realization brought tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. For the first time since that terrible phone call 3 years ago, Amira understood that grief and gratitude could coexist. That loss and love were not opposites, but different faces of the same truth. Over the following weeks, word spread through the town about the incident in the alley. The details grew more dramatic with each retelling, but the core message remained consistent. The quiet librarian was not as defenseless as everyone had assumed. Mrs. Brennan stopped suggesting Amira needed an escort. Mr. Hassan nodded approvingly when their paths crossed. Even the teenagers outside Murphy's diner looked at her with new respect. But the most important change was internal. Amira had spent 3 years feeling like half of herself, incomplete without her partner. Now she understood that Tariq had never really left. His love lived in every command Rex obeyed, every threat he neutralized, every moment of protection he provided. The partnership they had built continued, transformed but unbroken. On quiet evenings, when the lighthouse beams swept across her porch and the ocean whispered against the shore, Amira would remember Tariq's words about Rex. He won't just be a dog. He'll be a promise. The promise had been kept. Love had taken new form, had learned new ways to guard and guide and protect. It lived in the shadow that followed her through town, in the amber eyes that watched over her sleep, in the unshakable knowledge that some bonds transcend even death itself. She was never alone. She never had been. Love had simply learned to walk on 4 legs and speak in languages deeper than words.